What's up, Sci-Fam? It's your boy Nickel, and today we're going to talk about natural selection. So, natural selection, you can title your page Natural Selection. We're going to define natural selection, and then I'm going to show you and give you an example of this thing that was known as the peppered moth. It's a pretty famous example of natural selection. All right, so what is natural selection? Well, natural selection is when species change over time in response to different types of conditions, like environmental conditions or to resource availability and or sexual selection. So, for example, if there is an elk with a really large rack of antlers, they are able to outcompete the other elk. So therefore, they're able to outcompete the other ones. They reproduce more often, and so therefore they're going to end up having, they're going to share their genes, their traits with their offspring. So their offspring are going to typically have larger and larger antlers. So that'd be an example of where sexual selection is involved in selecting the natural traits of a population. Another thing could be resource availability. So if there is not a lot of food somewhere and there's an animal that can exploit a new type of food, then most likely they're going to survive because they're able to figure out a new way to eat. Since their normal type of food is not available, then only the ones that can find the way to eat are going to end up passing on their traits. So what this means is that traits that support successful survival and not only survival but and reproduction in the current environmental conditions end up becoming more common. So whatever the current environmental conditions are, whoever has the traits that support this, the most successful survival and successful reproduction end up becoming more common. And so one example of this are some finches that were on the Galapagos Islands when there were really, really large seeds that were coming from the trees, because the trees with large seeds were producing more of the food for the animals than there were small seeds. The birds with larger beaks ended up having a more higher chance of reproducing than birds with smaller beaks. So the next year there were more birds with large beaks than there were of small beaks. And then when there were smaller seeds, then the birds with smaller beaks ended up having more population than the ones with larger beaks, because there's more resources that help them survive. So a real life example, another one, is something that is known as the peppered moths. So in this real life example, black-bodied pepper moths became more abundant than the white-bodied, I'm going to say the peppered, how they got their name. The black-bodied peppered moths became more abundant than the white-bodied peppered moths. And the peppered moth, they were called the peppered moths because most of them were this white-bodied peppered kind of color. And the black-bodied peppered moths became more abundant than the actual peppered moths did during the Industrial Revolution. And this was a result, it resulted from factories which caused the environment to become more, we'll say, polluted by air pollution. And let me show you what I mean by that. So here's a picture that someone made of birds, and birds first in this top picture. They came to this tree and they're like, there's a bunch of moths. Well, there's a couple moths on here. And the peppered moths were able to blend in much better on the trees than the black-bodied moths were. So if a bird came to a tree with a bunch of moths on it, it would eat the black-bodied moths because those were easier to see and they could easily grab those moths. The other ones were camouflaged. But when the Industrial Revolution came through, and all of a sudden there's all these smokestacks producing a lot of pollution in the air, that black soot actually caused the trees to become a darker color. Well, now all of a sudden those peppered moths become more visible than the black-bodied moths. And so if we look at maybe what this actually looked like on the trees, here's a good example of why the peppered moths were so successful. Is the peppered moths were really good at blending in, the black-bodied moths stuck out, so birds would eat the black-bodied moths. But once the trees got more black because there's more air pollution and actually the stuff that was on it, it's not that the trees turned black necessarily, but they have less of that lichen because lichen is sensitive to air pollution. So when there's more air pollution, there's less lichen, so therefore there's less camouflage for those peppered moths, which is how they got their name. And then those black-bodied moths were better at camouflaging in the trees or on the bark. So if we go back then to our note page, the white-bodied moths, if we look at generations, and if we see that the Industrial Revolution happened right here, well, those white-bodied moths before the Industrial Revolution were not doing, or they were doing really well because there's a lot of lichen on the trees. So they had a very high population because they were able to camouflage in with the lichen on the trees. When the Industrial Revolution came in, they were doing okay, but maybe a few of them got picked off. And as the lichen started to die on the tree, all of a sudden those white-bodied moths were sticking out, and so they got eaten, so their population went way down and became very, very low. So before the Industrial Revolution, when people saw moths, there were these white-bodied moths. There's those peppered moths. That's how they got their name. But once the Industrial Revolution hit, the black-bodied moths were able to all of a sudden soar, and they were able to camouflage much better because the tree bark didn't have the lichen on it anymore. So therefore the black-bodied moths started to increase in population. So you can see here that the environmental conditions of what the environment was like ended up making one of these organisms' traits, the black or the white body, become more popular based on what was happening in the environment. And so it wasn't that the moths chose to change their color, it was that the environment actually caused them to become easier to be found by their predators. And since more of them were found by their predators, then the ones that were able to camouflage better ended up becoming more successful. So that is an example of natural selection, and there's tons of examples like this throughout nature. This is just a beginning.